About 150 years ago, archaeologists began unearthing artifacts long buried in the sands of Mesopotamia, the land of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates in present-day Iraq. Troves of small clay tablets covered in a script they came to call cuneiform, and carvings in stone and clay. About 6,000 years before that first moment of discovery, at the southern end of Mesopotamia, near a great marsh where the rivers converge before they empty into the head of the Persian Gulf, human beings began writing their words, putting their words into script, something that had never before been done. And for the next 3,500 years, Mesopotamian scribes wrote and artisans depicted all manner of things, including events in their times and events from ages past. From hundreds of thousands of these artifacts, it's possible to put together an incredible tale. An incredible story of the origin of Homo sapiens, an extraordinary birth, and of the shocking early times of humankind. Few have done it because scholars take the most important elements of the story to be fantasy, not fact. But it's a history hidden in plain sight in the artifacts in museums and libraries. As a matter of fact, you can go see some splendid examples of the Metropolitan Museum and in the Morgan Library and Museum. If the story is true, as I've come to believe that it is, it upends a great deal of what we think we know about ourselves and our world. Okay, an incredible story. Once upon a time, almost 500,000 years ago, long before the age of humans, giant, fair humanoids came to Earth from a planet that dwells most of the time in the dark cold of deep space. It passes through the inner solar system like a comet at long intervals, a golden globe so bright it rivals the sun. I'm going to go in and out of storytelling mode to give some commentary to help make things be more complete and clear. Astronomers right now are actively searching for a sizable planet at great distance from the sun, an undiscovered member of our solar system, and they're sure that it's there and heading our way because of the way in which its gravity is affecting the motions of the outermost bodies in the solar system. Astronomy buffs call it Planet X. The orbit of this planet is unique in our family of planets, but it turns out that it's not uncommon in our corner of the galaxy. As astronomers study star systems nearby, a number of them have planets in them with these long extended orbits moving out far from their suns. Now, planets form relatively close to their suns in a circular orbit, and astronomers have worked out that through gravitational interactions within the system, these planets were flung out, almost out of the system, but coming back in like a comet. So it must be that that's what happened with the home planet that these visitors came from. Okay, back to the story. The peoples of Mesopotamia called the giants who had come to this world by several names: Earth Lords, Righteous Ones of the Sky Chambers, Watchers, and those of heaven who are on earth, Anunnaki in Mesopotamia's first language. An meaning heaven, ki meaning earth, and that's a term we'll use, Anunnaki. In the next language to develop in Mesopotamia, the first of the Semitic tongues, southern Mesopotamia, where the visitors first settled, was Shumer, land of the watchers. And the visitors were the Elu, the lofty ones. Elu is another term we'll use, but in translation, lofty ones. Elu evolved into terms for the divinity in the later Semitic languages. El in Hebrew and Allah in Arabic. Back to the story. The surface of the home planet of the Anunnaki was made habitable by a heat-reflecting shell of gold high in its atmosphere. Now, the population must have gone underground during the ejection from its original orbit, something like the city of Zion from the Matrix movies. And later, the engineers deployed this shell of tiny particles, which contained artificially generated heat, and also made the planet brilliant when it approached the sun. Back to the story. A crisis was approaching. The shell was failing, but the planet's gold supplies were depleted. An explorer had earlier found gold on Earth. An expedition was sent out in hopes of mining the material and transporting it back home. The place where the colonists first settled, it's in the vicinity of present-day Basra. It had many advantages. In the great marsh nearby, giant reeds for the initial crafting of buildings and vessels. A wide plain to the north where spacecraft could glide to land. Petroleum substances near the surface for energy, and access to the sea for gold shipped from distant sources. They called their first settlement home in the faraway, Eridu, and the immediately surrounding area, home of the righteous ones, Eden. Eridu is the source of the name of our planet in many languages. Ard, Yord, Eretz, Earth. And Eden, the domain of the lofty ones, became the name of God's garden in Genesis. And Ki, as in Anunnaki, is the source of our root Geo. Back to the story. When the colony was still young, a dynastic conflict on the home planet spilled over onto Earth, with many nobles fighting in a great battle. There were some details in the accounts of that battle that make it clear that it's the historical source of the Greek legend of the Battle of the Titans. From then on, warfare on Earth was never absent for long. The descendants of Enki, the Anunnaki prince who led the first colonists, claimed that their clan's rights had been usurped when Enlil, Enki's younger half-brother, arrived with another band of colonists and was appointed supreme ruler by An, their father, the king of the home planet. He'd come to settle the dispute between the brothers over the leadership of the colony. Conflict between the two clans would forever play out in warfare that was driven by lusts for rights, power, glory, and riches. The lifespans of the lofty ones were extremely long. The high nobles lived for times that made them seem immortal. Substances called the bread of life and the water of life were supplied regularly from the home world. So the extraordinary longevity of the lofty ones was due to their genetics, which may have been modified, as well as advanced anti-aging medicine. The sources of gold for the Anunnaki were in eastern and southern Africa. Conditions in the mines were harsh. Gold is still found in those areas, and the conditions in the mines are still harsh. The Anunnaki commoners had been working the mines for many centuries when finally they had enough and mutinied. Enlil traveled to Africa from Eden to see for himself what was happening. He was taken hostage and threatened with death. Enki, gifted scientist and engineer, and chief of the gold operations, boldly announced that he'd seen a way to resolve the tense impasse. He had observed a hominin in the nearby African wilds, small and primitive, yet in many ways similar to their own kind. He was talking about the species we call Homo erectus, the immediate predecessor of Homo sapiens. Enki would work with Ninmah, sister to Enlil and himself, also a scientist, and midwife to the lofty ones. They would take the African creature, use Anunnaki genes to modify it, and produce a race of servants. An, who had come to Earth to see the crisis resolved, gave Enki and Ninmah permission to proceed. Their brother gave grumpy assent. After lengthy trial and error, the last step of which made the hybrid capable of procreation, in Enki's compound in Africa, the first Homo sapiens were born. The Mesopotamian creation epics, supplemented by carvings, laud and illustrate the laboratory proceedings. In the pre-scientific and poetic language of the epics, it's clear what was involved was genetic manipulation, in vitro fertilization, and initially surrogate birth mothers. In confirmation of these accounts, Zulu oral tradition holds that there were once mines in Zimbabwe worked by flesh and blood slaves created by the first people on Earth. Now also, there are puzzles in the standard view of human evolution that the creation epics resolve. Our bones are so different from those of Homo erectus, our predecessor species, that given the steady rate of evolution, we shouldn't be here for another 1,000,000 years. So no wonder traditional faith and conventional science won't yield, because they're both correct to a point. We were naturally evolved up to the level of Homo erectus. And we were made in the image and likeness of God, to borrow the terms in Genesis, when the Anunnaki lords gave us some of their genes. Back to the story. The Anunnaki commoners in Sumer asked for humans to be brought out of Africa so that they too could have their work done by the new race. Earthmen were delivered to Eden, where they were taught to be laborers, farmers, boatmen, and servants. This is one of the many bits of history in the tablets that are reflected in Genesis. The quote, "And the Lord took the Adam," which is Hebrew for earthman, and he placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to tend it. Other humans migrated from Africa on their own, spreading out. They were the descendants of the first people who either were released or slipped away from Enki's compound. Then later, humans spread out from Mesopotamia on their own. So consider there's a critical piece missing as science tries to put together the movements and interactions of prehistoric populations, because the indigenous and pastoral peoples of the world, according to this history, are really the descendants of the escapees from civilization. Back to the story. Settlement moved inland and upriver, away from the head of the Persian Gulf. New cities with predominantly human populations were founded. Enthralled with the tall, brilliant, skilled, beautifully clothed, fair, lofty ones, the people of the cities, materially dependent, physically and intellectually inferior, short-lived, dark, and naked, did not need to be coerced into servitude. To us, it was slavery. To the first people of civilization, it was the natural order of things. Inferiority, dependence, and humiliation created the first sense of self for civilized humanity. That was very useful for our lords and fateful for us. Back to the story. The Anunnaki flew from place to place and into the heavens in their sky chambers. They bore thunderbolt weapons. Several of the highest ranked among the lofty ones claimed to be personifications on earth of the celestial deities, the planets, and the signs of the zodiac. So it came to pass that these flesh and blood rulers of civilized humanity were not only obeyed and loved, they were worshipped. The settlements established in Mesopotamia, including cities such as Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, and Babylon, had an overall ruler. Each of these was one of the 12 most highly ranked Anunnaki lords. Each city was also administered by a king, one of the many relatives of the ruling circle of 12. An, king of the home planet, had bestowed the institution of kingship on the colony as a great honor. Besides forming the laboring masses of the cities, humans were the foot soldiers in the armies of the lofty ones. And for this role, too, no coercion was needed. To fight and die for one's beloved God and to kill the followers of his enemy were glorious deeds. So an oft-repeated crossing of brain circuits that were never meant to connect, loving devotion and killing rage, resulted in, well, it was another fateful aspect, put it this way, of life under the Anunnaki, for it resulted in us becoming a traumatized species, literally in love with war. The story. The carnage in the wars was horrendous, especially when a deity took part and wielded his or her personal weapon, laying waste the opposing troops. These battles are recast in the Old Testament in the scenes where God wipes out the enemy that the Jews are facing. The never-ending warfare of the Anunnaki resulted in a pattern that would be copied by human culture when it arose. Wars begun and led by an elite lusting for power and riches. Back to the story. The noble Anunnaki males had wives, but there were few females for the male commoners, who began taking human women as wives. The fruit of those marriages, the men of renown, naturally were more like the Anunnaki than any humans had ever been. This was a development so fateful for humanity that Genesis reports it without any modification at all. In the language of the King James Version. Those who came down were in the earth in those days. The sons of the gods came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, mighty men of old. For example, Methuselah, the grandfather of Noah. Now, the standard translations purposely blur this lucid account. But there's a truth hidden in plain sight in the Hebrew, because the mass of humanity was now inferior not just to the Anunnaki, but to taller, smarter, longer-lived elite humans. But these mighty men had to be insecure in their status, because the original imprint of slavery could not be erased with their elevation. Why is this fateful? Combining this lasting deep insecurity in the elite with the unnaturally wide disparity of skill in the human population, resulting from the second level of hybridization, a few humans getting an additional component of Anunnaki genes, has led to a curse for humanity. The subjugation and the exploitation of less endowed people by their superiors, who are to some extent driven by a dread of slaves' inferiority within themselves. Back to the story. Supported by their enthralled slaves, the lofty ones lived in luxury. The mines were productive. Periodically, the colony sent loads of gold and ingots to the home planet. Gold was plentiful, used for personal adornment, dinnerware, and ceremonial objects. That's the historical basis for the legends of the Golden Age, the time when it was a glorious first time for humanity. It was glorious for the gods, not for the servants. Back to the story. The highest ranking god, Enlil, originally pressured to accept the crafting of his servant race, hadn't ever been fond of humanity. And when his own kind began taking humans as mates, he was disgusted. He made attempts to decimate the human population, but his cruel campaigns were thwarted by his brother Enki, humanity's maker and champion. And then another crisis loomed. On its next transit of the inner solar system, their home planet would come close to Earth, wreak havoc, and trigger a watery catastrophe. Enlil was pleased. A natural event was going to do the job of wiping out civilized humankind for him, as long as the people were kept in the dark. He had the nobles swear an oath to do just that. Enki angrily objected to taking it, but gave in and joined the others. He was unwilling, though, to witness the utter destruction of his children in Mesopotamia. To save a remnant of civilized humanity so that the population could eventually be rebuilt, he directed one of his devotees to build a vessel to ride out the flood and to carry seeds of life, genetic material, to restore their cultures, animals, and plants. Using a ruse that avoided formally breaking the oath, he informed the man what to build and to keep its purpose secret. The Mesopotamian flood epics report this sequence of events. The golden planet approaches. The Anunnaki learn of the impending flood. A powerful gale blows from the south. A loud roar fills the air. Clouds darken the sky. The lofty ones take off. A massive downpour. A wall of water. Now, Earth was in a warming phase already at this time. We're talking about circa 11,000 BCE. And so like now, there was increased precipitation, polar ice instability, and rising seas. As the planets drew near each other, gravitational, magnetic, and electrical interactions resulted in storms, earthquakes, and volcanoes. We can surmise what happened. Unstable conditions in the Antarctic, such as we're witnessing right now, plus rains lubricating the ice, plus the upheaval of the crust combined, resulted in portions of the Antarctic ice cap suddenly breaking off and plunging into the sea, generating a tsunami dwarfing those that we've experienced in our times. Wave surged up the oceans, resulting in the stories of a great flood in many, many cultures. And as it surged up the Persian Gulf, towards the head of the Gulf, it plowed up the sediment that had been deposited there by the rivers flowing in from ages past, so that Mesopotamia was drowned and buried. Back to the story. Watching from orbit, the gods were miserable and horrified, seeing the destruction of their cities and the death of their people. As the water receded, they spotted the vessel of salvation. Hungry and thirsty, they landed and were attended by the human survivors who, remaining in row, prepared food for them. Enlil was enraged at the apparent violation of the nobles' oath of secrecy, but relented and swore to never again cause harm to mankind. In Genesis, as the waters were receding, God made the same pledge with his rainbow. Now, the destruction of the world of the Anunnaki was a defining event in the history of Mesopotamia. There are many, many texts that differentiate the times before the flood from the times after the flood. So for the Hebrews, whose culture was rooted in Mesopotamia, the deluge was too central to forget, but also too terrifying to remember clearly. So they were provided with a radical revision, a weaving of fact and fiction that helped to move their culture from the history of the lofty ones to the theology of the one. Evidence for the flood first appeared in the early 20th century in a shaft dug at the site of the city of Ur. And under about 3 feet thick of the usual debris of a ruined city was found a layer 10 feet thick of mud, so uniform that it could only have been brought by water, and so laced with the remains of tiny marine organisms that the water could only have been from the ocean. This layer, as it turned out, with other excavations, was about 100 miles wide, 400 miles deep into Mesopotamia, okay, thinning out as it went further and further from the head of the Gulf. It continued with this shaft, and the archaeologist was astounded to find the remains of the original city of Ur. He didn't know what to make of it. His wife woke him up and said, "We just discovered the flood of the Bible." And he was so excited by the significance of this that he cabled his colleagues back in Philadelphia at the museum at Penn in Latin. In time, his profession dismissed the findings as insignificant river flooding, even though that was very much at variance with the facts. But that's often the fate of inconvenient findings. Back to the story. Contemplating the rebuilding of their world, the royal brothers came to a fateful decision. No longer would humans be restricted to low-level tasks. Qualified men would be granted the knowledge and skills they'd need to reconstruct and maintain civilization. There would be human scientists, technicians, teachers, artists, musicians, and even kings. As before, each city would be ruled by a deity and administered by a king, though in the new age the sovereign would be human, a man of renown, descended from high-ranking, lofty ones, and from humans also distinguished by birth. The demigod kings would serve as the needed intermediaries between the gods and humanity. On the home planet, An had three symbols of authority: the tiara for his divinity, the scepter for his power, and the shepherd's staff for the guidance he provided. Replicas of his symbols were awarded to the Mesopotamian kings. After the Anunnaki were gone, human kings would inherit the scepter and the crown. The shepherd's staff went to the bishops, along, of course, with the crown and the scepter went the divine right to rule. To the story again. It would take time for the mud to dry so that the cities could be rebuilt and for the human population to be restored, about 4,000 years. A new spaceport, though, was needed immediately. The two in Mesopotamia were buried in thick mud, and the surviving one in the central Sinai was too distant. It had been built to serve the Anunnaki who were ruling Egypt. One was built nearby in the west at a site high above the flood. Now, there's an enormous ruin in an isolated mountain valley in Lebanon called Baalbek, Cleft of the Lord. And on a broad platform there stood the largest temples that the Romans ever built to Jupiter and to Venus. And under their temples, archaeologists have found 6 more layers of temples: Greek, Assyrian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and Sumerian. What made this site so holy? Its physical characteristics, which we can't get into right now, and relevant texts make it clear this was a base used by the Anunnaki to reach heaven. Arab tradition, said to be based on ancient lost texts, says that the platform was built by a race of giants soon after the flood. Back to the story. New cities were built on the sites of the original settlements. Within a few hundred years, they had everything that characterizes civilized life: wheeled vehicles and draft animals, boats of different types, canals for irrigation and transport, baked bricks and paved streets, libraries, temples, granaries, schools, and multi-story houses, metals and fine textiles, domesticated stock, grains, and fruits, a musical scale and instruments, board games, judges and juries, civic administration with bicameral legislatures, money, measures, and weights, organized commerce, customs duties, and finance. The range of the writing of the scribes is equally impressive. They recorded the chronologies of dynasties and wars, essays on philosophy, geography, biology, and education, texts of advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, surgery, and pharmacology, epics, proverbs, poems, songs, and memoirs. Guides for grammar and vocabulary, food and beverage recipes, contracts and commercial records, marriage and inheritance customs, court records, and codes of criminal, family, and even tax law. Given the gradual rate of progress in prehistoric cultures and in early centuries of civilization, such richness should have taken thousands of years to develop. Yet, as the cities were rebuilt, they had all this in the blink of an eye. Without precursors in the Middle East or elsewhere, scholars note the quandary presented by civilization flashing into existence in Sumer, and they blithely refrain from offering any explanation, as if they're confident that science someday will explain the mystery. It won't, as long as they stick to the established paradigm, because as our incredible story says, civilization was the gift of the gods. Back to the story. As the human population grew, once again, the Anunnaki lords and the kings serving them organized armies and resumed the heartless shedding of human blood as in the age before the deluge. As before, the city of one deity would achieve dominance over the others, and then in time, its forces would be defeated, and another city and its god would rule supreme. Alliances were made and broken, rivalries waxed and waned, in endlessly repeating cycles of destruction and reconstruction. Now, scholars have laboriously assembled the documentary history of this time, great detail. In the conventional paradigm, the kings and priests invented these unseen, ever-present, all-powerful deities in order to better manipulate those who they ruled. They have no way to grasp that the real power in the land was a race of self-deified flesh and blood giants. Back to the story. The prime force driving Mesopotamian warfare remained the rivalry between the clans of Enlil and Enki. At one point, Enki's oldest son, Marduk, made a claim, based in astrology, that the time had come for him to ascend and be acknowledged as the chief of all the lofty ones. Meaning to reverse what he saw as the original theft of his father's rights by his uncle Enlil, Marduk launched fierce military campaigns, including a thrust toward the Sinai spaceport. The prospect of his enemy possessing one of the two launch facilities so alarmed Enlil that he resolved to deny it to Marduk with the only means available, destroying it. Weapons of terror had been hidden by Enki when the Earth colony was founded. Ignoring Enki's dire warnings, Enlil authorized two of Marduk's rivals to use the powerful bombs. In these events, we have two overlapping narratives, the biblical and the Mesopotamian. From 2 points of view, the same things are described. This battle involved not just the spaceport, but 5 cities immediately north of the Sinai that were also destroyed. They were in the western Mesopotamian diaspora. They were destroyed in hopes of killing Marduk's son. In Genesis, this is the war of the kings of the west against the kings of the east. Kings of the western cities allied under Marduk, and the kings of the east, cities loyal to Enlil. the bulk of Mesopotamia in the east. The best known of these 5 cities, by the way, is Sodom and Gomorrah. And the language of the Bible's description of these cities is a close parallel to the language of the bombing runs in the Mesopotamian epics. Here's an interesting little overlap. Lot's wife she tarried and was, according to standard translation, turned into a pillar of salt. But the word for salt actually could also be translated so that she was turned into a column of vapor, which is a pretty good description of somebody who's caught in a fireball.
Ouch.
Ouch. After the aerial attack, back to the story, a cloud of death drifted east on the prevailing winds, a cloud against which there was no defense, a cloud that caused widespread devastation in southern Mesopotamia, though no physical destruction. Most of the noble Anunnaki fled. Lengthy, gruesome, heart-rending laments over the deaths of the cities of southern Mesopotamia make it clear the cloud contained radioactive fallout. So we didn't need Hiroshima and Nagasaki to know what would happen to people who were exposed to radioactive fallout. It's hidden in plain sight in these texts. Back to the story. The rule of Mesopotamia by Enlil and his sons had already been weakened, partly from Marduk's relentless assaults. Now, the cultures of Sumer were no more, and most of the lofty ones were gone. Not only were they horrified by what they had wrought, they realized that the lofty ones who'd come to earth were aging faster than their peers at home, and that the offspring born here were aging even faster, some even dying. In northwest Mesopotamia, Babylon, Marduk's city, had been barely touched by the deadly cloud. He convinced the remaining nobles, reeling from the result of having opposed him, to declare him their supreme lord. Renaming the home planet for himself, Marduk had a new creation epic written, misrepresenting important events and glorifying himself. The Babylonian creation epic was the first big lie told by a power-mad ruler. Unfortunately, it was the first creation epic unearthed by the archaeologists, and it was so filled with obvious theologically framed propaganda that it inclined scholars to regard the older epics that they later discovered as being products of human imagination. When in reality, those accounts had been given by the lofty ones to the scribes to record in an enduring medium, so humanity could always have access to its true history, as we now do. Finishing the story. Marduk called for a glorious age, but it turned out to be a time of turmoil in the region, in part because of earthquakes, volcanoes, and famines in the Middle East and the Mediterranean basin. The shift of power from Anunnaki nobles to human kings, going on for some time, accelerated. Human rulers, for the first time, waged war, plundered, and destroyed totally on their own. Humanity had learned very well. A final series of wars was instigated by the few remaining gods, who seemed not to realize that the reign of their kind was ending. In the regional melee, Babylon was twice sacked and restored. The northern kingdom of Israel was occupied, scattering the northern tribes of the kingdom of Israel, the 10 lost tribes. A monotheistic king from the west, Cyrus from the east, Cyrus the Great, was welcomed with his army into Babylon. So when Marduk took Cyrus's hand in greeting, that signaled the end of the last culture that was linked with then ancient Sumer. By the end of the 6th century BCE, the tablets would no longer mention the Anunnaki. And so ends our incredible story, left for us in bits and pieces by the scribes. Epilogue. If truthful, this incredible story helps us to better understand why we are as we are. For it appears that we're still living in its drama. The scenery, the costumes have changed, the script is much the same. 3 elements of the story explain much about the sources of our profoundly troubled state. Our extraordinary origin led to our confusion about identity and purpose and a deep sense of alienation. The only species that ever appeared with no forebears of its own kind and no environmental niche to fit into. Universal enslavement produced negative self-concepts and an exquisite vulnerability to shame. And destructive behaviors, too numerous to name, result from our attempts to defend against shame-based emotions. And 3, endless warfare on behalf of rulers with whom we were enthralled made of us a traumatized race bonded to violence. Exploring how contagion, reenactment, and the workings of the collective unconscious have perpetuated these 3 sources of dysfunction would take a book, which is why I've written Finding Our Long Way Home, which I hope you'll soon be reading.